So now that you understand a little bit about what aggregate demand is, let's look at the different factors that actually cause aggregate demand to move. So, like I said in the previous video, GDP in the United States is the combination of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And you've probably heard in the past that our economy is about 70% consumption. So it means that the American consumer is an incredibly important part of the economy when you think about it. The fact that we spend money really drives the economy, which after 9/11, George Bush came out and said, we want the Americans to start spending again, and he gave us all a big tax cut. And so, that is all to just drive aggregate demand forward. Excuse me. So we have the same slide that we saw in the last video. An increase in spending will shift aggregate demand to the right, and a decrease in spending will shift it to the left. And what we're talking about is consumptive spending by individuals, investment spending by businesses, government spending by the government, or net exports spending by foreign nations in this country, right? So a shift to the right will be an increase in aggregate demand, and a shift to the left will be a decrease in aggregate demand, just like in basic supply and demand. So there's no real problems there. So to just go over it again, I've added two more components of aggregate demand there at the bottom. They might be cut off a little bit by the screen. But consumption, investment, we're talking about businesses investing in their own businesses in this country, government spending, and net exports. I added something called the money supply or the money stock and velocity of money. Right now, I will just ask you to sort of put that in the back of your head. When we get into the Federal Reserve, we're going to talk about why that would also stimulate aggregate demand. It's not simply as simple as, the Federal Reserve increases the money supply and immediately aggregate demand increases. But there are some steps that makes that happen. So all you have to do is know C plus I plus G plus net exports, and you change any one of those and you will get a change in aggregate demand. So the first one is obviously a change in consumer spending. If consumer wealth changes, let's say that there's a boom in the stock market, what do you think is going to happen to aggregate demand? If there's consumer expectations, a lot of our economy is actually about trust and faith and confidence. So if people fear that a recession is coming, like after 9/11, I mean, everybody knew that a recession was going to come because when you're attacked, people tighten up. That's going to cause consumer spending to go down. If consumers have a lot of debt, you're probably headed for a big recession. And that was one of the problems right before the Great Recession is household debt was at some of its highest levels. And when you have a lot of debt, you're often paying off debt and not spending money in the economy. And taxes. If there's a decrease in income taxes, in 2017, the House and the Senate passed a large tax cut that should increase aggregate demand because people are going to feel like they have more money to spend. Two, if there's a change in investment spending, so if real interest rates change, if the interest rates increase, what do you think businesses are going to do? Are they going to take more loans or less loans? Well, they're going to take less loans, and thus it's going to decrease the amount that they invest in their own businesses. But if interest rates decreased, they would take more loans, they would buy that new piece of heavy machinery, they might expand, etc. Future business expectations. If there are high expectations, obviously they're going to invest in their own company. Productivity and technology, new robots are going to not only help you produce more, but that's a change in investment spending also. And just like this tax cut in 2017, you know, this says higher corporate taxes means less investment. In this case, the tax rate is being dropped from 30% down into the 20s. So that should increase the amount of investment spending by businesses. So the third thing is obviously the change in government spending. You go to war, you got to spend money, you got to support those troops, buy more planes. That's going to increase aggregate demand. If you develop a nationalized healthcare system, while Obamacare isn't a universal healthcare system, it is much expanded, and that's brought a lot of government spending, especially in the increase in Medicaid. And all of those would increase aggregate demand. You know, if you aren't paying for your healthcare anymore, guess what? You can go out into the economy and spend money somewhere else, which will boost aggregate demand. And that spending on your healthcare is now done by the government. But if you decrease defense spending, then you're going to be decreasing aggregate demand. And last but not least, a change in net exports. If exchange rates change, so for example, if the US dollar depreciates relative to the euro, what happens? Now, we haven't talked about exchange rates yet. We're going to talk about that in some of the last modules in the course. But if the US dollar depreciates relative to the euro, that means that the euro is more expensive for us and our goods are cheaper to people in Europe. So our net exports would go up, and thus our GDP would go up and our aggregate demand would go up. If our national income compared to other countries is higher, you're going to have more people, you're going to have more Americans having a lot of money to then spend on other goods, and that's going to decrease net exports because we're going to be importing more than we're exporting. If the U.S. has a recession, obviously, I've talked about this before, our goods become very cheap to other countries, and that's a boost to our aggregate demand. So again, just don't forget the absolute basics of aggregate demand. If any of these are shifting, C plus I plus G plus net exports, then you're going to see a shift in some way. And I think if you can put that away, you'll have a decent command of this. Take a look at these two cartoons and you can see how it relates to aggregate demand. So it shows the holiday shoppers are pulling the U.S. economy, and it says another fine tradition of the season. We know that aggregate demand is boosted in the holiday season because consumers are spending lots of cash. And then here you can see Uncle Sam is about to give the banks a bailout, but he says, boy, am I glad to see you. I was starting to fear the worst because consumer spending is crashing the U.S. economy in a big recession. All right. I think that the shifts of aggregate demand is pretty straightforward, and next we will be moving on to aggregate supply.